Welcome to a podcast of unnecessary detail. I'm Matt Parker.
I'm Helen Arney.
I'm Steve Mould, and together we make comedy shows about science.
Yeah, and when we're researching stuff for new shows, we often find that the delight is in the detail.
And yes, the journey down the path of extra detail is often a little bit longer, but the reward is always greater. And that's what this podcast is all about.
We're solitary creatures at heart, but sometimes we like to come together and share our findings. This time we've all been digging up detail about fuel.
Yeah, I'm talking about fuel for your body.
I'm talking about plain fuel, or a lack thereof.
I'm talking about coal.
Oh, wow. Sounds like you're taking a surprisingly pro-fossil fuel stance there, Steve.
Yeah. Nothing wrong with burning coal. That's what I've discovered in my research. There's no side effects at all.
Yeah. Let's find some detail on that.
Matt, what have you got to talk about?
So, one of my favourite stories involving fuel, or rather a lack of fuel, was a flight in the 1980s where a Air Canada flight was flying across Canada from Edmonton to Montreal, and they put an insufficient amount of fuel in the aircraft. Which you think, how on earth could a plane take off with not enough fuel? Surely in a plane there are so many checks. And the reason it was a problem in the first place was it was a unit conversion error. So this was right when Canada was switching from imperial to metric units, and they'd switched over the way they were fueling aircraft.
Blame colonialism for all of this.
Exactly. Well, hey, a small price to pay to get onto real units. And so in a car, you'll use litres or gallons for fuel because volume is so much easier to measure. Whereas for a plane, because volume changes with temperature, that's not quite accurate enough. So you do it in mass.
How much does it change?
Actually, I'm not sure how much it varies. Enough that for a Boeing 767, when you're putting in 22,600 kilograms of fuel, it must make a bit of a difference.
Yeah.
And so that makes the calculation slightly more complicated, because if you're measuring the amount of fuel in an aircraft, you actually measure the volume first, then you convert it to mass to work out how much fuel that would be. And so what they did was they initially calculated exactly how much fuel they'd need for this flight in kilograms, and then they accidentally put in that many pounds.
Matt, is this one of these funny stories where at the end you're like, and everyone died?
No, it's okay. So in this story, everybody lives, and they get so close to disaster. So the plane actually runs out of fuel midair, but the pilot, before they became a commercial airline pilot, they used to be a glider pilot. And so they were able to glide this Boeing 787.
I mean, that is amazing because a bunch of things must have gone wrong in order for this to have happened, to get half as much fuel. Because what is a pound is like half a kilogram,
Yeah, it's
right?
about 45% of a kilogram, so it's just under half. So what happened was, first of all, they had an issue with the sensors. So they've got these sensors that are in the tanks, and they measure how much fuel is in there. They send that into a processing unit that then sends it to the gauge on the dashboard so they can see whatever the dashboard equivalent is in an airplane. Not an aviation expert, but I am a calculation expert. So initially they had an issue with this thing that took the reading from the sensors in, and they realized one flight prior, if you unplug one of them, it starts working again. Like, what? And they plug it in, stops working. Unplug it, working. So the technician who was working on the aircraft is like, that's odd. Well, while I'm ordering a replacement unit, I could just leave one unplugged and it will work, but now there's no longer any redundancy. And redundancy is the name of the game in aviation. So they were like, oh, okay, we can still be safe to fly if, as well as having one sensor working, we also do a manual check. And they double checked and that was all fine. So one sensor works and someone physically goes out with a stick and puts it in the tank and checks there's enough fuel.
Nice.
And that worked fine for that
Does that
flight.
work like a dipstick? You put a long...
Exactly like a dipstick. Yeah, put a stick in there, see how much fuel you got, no worries. But then when it landed at the end of that flight and was about to do the return journey, they were changing pilots. And the pilot who was flying over is like, oh, hey, we got this issue with the fuel gauges, but don't worry, as long as we do a manual check, it's still fine. And the next pilot's like, oh, brilliant, thanks for letting me know. And the technicians don't really hand over properly. And so the new technician comes in and goes, hey, why is this unplugged? Right? Plugs it in, and then it stops working. And they're like, oh, that's not good. I better go report that. They go off to report that, never come back to unplug it. Meanwhile, they do the manual check, And when they do the manual check, they do pounds instead of kilograms.
Oh.
And the reason why this was kind of easy to do is it wasn't like they were entering the number of pounds. They would measure the volume. They then use the specific gravity conversion from the current temperature for how dense the fuel would be.
What?
And because specific gravity kind of hides what units you're using, they looked up the wrong specific gravity. They did the specific gravity for that kind of fuel at that temperature for pounds, not for kilograms. And so it's just slightly different numbers. So it's an easy mistake to make. It's not quite as bad as if they were literally just entering the wrong units.
Yeah.
But when the pilot got on, they saw the gauges weren't working and they remembered the conversation and they misunderstood. They're like, oh, they said there's a problem with the gauges. They didn't realize the problem is they're working, but without the redundancy. They just thought, oh, they're not working. That's the problem. As long as we do the manual check, we're fine. But the manual check...
Then the pilot took it down to one check
Yeah.
by misunderstanding. So the pilot was like, oh, just one check is fine. That's normal for flying an aircraft the whole time that I always do.
Yes, and I have to admit, afterwards, everyone survives. And the pilot was like, everyone was amazed that no one died because they were able to fly this aircraft. However, I think they were suspended for 6 months. Like, there were some repercussions afterwards that this even happened. And it's this weird balance of the flight crew were incredibly heroic, nobody died.
Yeah.
But also, how'd this happen in the first place?
Yeah.
And yeah, my jury's out because there were so many mistakes. I think it's not fair to pin it on any one person in the chain.
It's a perfect storm.
Exactly.
I wonder, maybe the rule should be, if you've built this system with redundant checks and things like that, when something goes wrong, you shouldn't just say, well, we'll sort of add some redundancy on the fly because that's when human error can creep in. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know. But the thing is, you need to have a way that if you lose one redundancy, there was a system to get another one put in and make sure it's okay, which they did. But then...
They failed the fail-safe.
Yeah. And there's a great thing in accident prevention called the Swiss cheese model, which I love, which is that you'll have these redundancies and double checks and safety checks, and you imagine them as like barriers to stop mistakes getting into your system. But no one check is perfect. Because it's humans, right? Humans are very creative at mistakes. So they're all going to have some holes in them. And so you just hope if a mistake makes it through a few checks, because it happens to get through a hole, it's going to hit a slice eventually and stop. But, no matter how many slices of cheese you have, there's a chance the holes will line up and a mistake will get all the way through and disaster. Although there's other models called the hot cheese model, where you imagine the cheese slices horizontally, but they're hot and they might drip because the checks you put into your system can themselves cause mistakes. So it's not just a case of shoving more and more and more checks. Too many checks or anything like that are going to cause errors. It's amazing. The logic.
Every time you add a new moving part, it might fail.
Exactly.
And it might cause other parts to fail as well.
Yeah, so adding new slices of cheese to your system doesn't always help.
I always wonder when I'm putting fuel in the car, is there an optimum? Because when I'm adding fuel, I'm adding weight to the vehicle. So if I fill the tank up completely, then it's really heavy. To begin with, I'm less efficient. But obviously, the process of going to a petrol station to fill up is inefficient as well. It's certainly time inefficient for me.
Well, this is the Formula One problem.
Yeah.
Where if you're in a Formula One race, do you start with loads of fuel in your car, so you won't have to take a pit stop for ages? Or do you start with not much fuel, you'll be lighter, you'll get out the front of the pack, but then you have to have your pit stop. And then if you do that technique, you might have to have one more pit stop over the course. And that's obviously very inefficient.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's...
But if you've gained your advantage,
yeah,
you can afford another pit stop.
But the fact that it's a strategy that varies and a lot of money is thrown at F1, I suspect no one's cracked that.
There was an issue in the news of airlines fueling up in slightly cheaper regions where the fuel was ever so slightly cheaper. They would put more fuel into the airplane, which would be much less fuel efficient, like your problem, Steve, just to save like $30 or something. But because it was burning so much more fuel, the climate impact was huge compared to this tiny cost saving. And airlines are getting some flack, rightly so, about it, because they're looking at refueling as a purely economic thing rather than an environmental
Which they will.
thing. Because
it's almost like there should be a cost to the... Carbon emissions.
Yeah. So how do you solve that problem? Because they're having the same problem as you, Steve, but they're just going for the cost efficiency. They're just saying, right, well, money's the most important thing.
I mean, I was too, but I just couldn't work it out. No, it's a good point though. Yeah, what is the carbon footprint equivalent? I was thinking like when you're using satellite navigation, it's going to tell me the quickest way to get somewhere. It'd be nice if it also told me the most fuel efficient way to get somewhere.
Oh, well,
Which you should be able to do.
Yeah.
This is also a variation on the rocket equation, where if you want to launch a rocket, you got to put fuel on it to launch it, but the fuel has mass. So you got to have more fuel to the point where if you want to put another kilogram of payload on, you got to get way more fuel because you got to put on the extra fuel to lift the new payload and the extra fuel to lift the extra fuel and the extra fuel. And yeah, it's very inefficient. Giant slingshot.
So I'd say don't take your kids to school in a rocket, Steve.
No, I'll scrap that then. That was my next plan.
I am basically an awful person right now because I do not drink caffeine.
Yay,
Yeah.
team no caffeine.
Yeah, it's me and Steve versus Matt at this point.
And I consume a lot of caffeine.
Yeah, coffee used to be, and I guess still is, my daily fuel. But now the coffee I drink contains no caffeine for several reasons, most of which was when my daughter woke up first thing in the morning, she would say, "Mummy, I want to cuddle." And the first thing I would think was, do I have time to make a coffee first?
Wow.
Yeah.
Do you know why? Do you know why I quit? It's because my wife said to me, when you have caffeine and then you don't have it the next day, you're a bit mean.
Oh!
She was able to pick when you had and had not had caffeine.
That's right. She did not know. And she would say, "Did you have caffeine yesterday or something?"
Really?
Yeah. And I'd say, "Yeah, I did. Sorry."
She was keeping her own data on your meanness.
Yeah. She didn't set up a Google Calendar for it or anything, but...
Well, she did. She didn't tell you. So I'm now decaffeinated. I've been 11 months and counting. Thank you very much.
Congratulations.
Yeah, I feel good. The smugness is almost unbearable, but I'm coping
You're
with
telling
it.
us.
Yeah.
Can I just say I'm vegan too?
It's not a competition, Steve.
Apparently it is.
The reason I wanted to talk about this is because I have decaffeinated fuel now, and I still drink it pretty much every day, but I have never really thought about what decaffeinates my coffee.
I'm particularly interested about this because I went caffeine free for 1 month. And
Wimp.
one of the reasons I went back was I couldn't find good decaf coffee. So I'm like, what are they doing to this coffee to get the caffeine out?
Well, let's talk about how to defuel your fuel. So why do coffee plants have caffeine in to start with? Firstly, the falling leaves contaminate the soil around, basically meaning that it kills the competition. I didn't know this.
Wow.
Yeah. They're basically creating their own weed killer for other plants.
That's amazing.
One you might know about is if insects attack the plant, the caffeine can be toxic to them in large doses. So insects and pests will basically avoid the coffee plant. Another one I didn't know, coffee plants lace their nectar with tiny amounts of caffeine. So pollinators that come and get the nectar basically get a buzz. It gives bees a buzz, is what I'm saying.
Wow.
Yeah. So then they remember that plant, they go further to take the pollen elsewhere, they come back to the plant more often. It basically helps the plants pollinate by being more attractive to pollinators. How cool is that?
Wait, so hold on. Because when you said that, my first thought was you give them a bit of caffeine, they're going to do their job better and quicker.
Yeah.
Oh, it's that as well.
Yeah,
So it's not
that
just
as
that
well.
they're addicted to it. It's
Yeah.
that they do it quicker and better.
They remember that this plant gave them a little high, and it also helps them take the pollen a bit further, maybe. I don't know.
You're making some great arguments for caffeine.
Yeah, I really am. And it turns out there's been some research recently looking at the DNA of coffee plants, and caffeine in coffee is the same molecule as you get in cocoa, cacao plants or tea, but it was evolved differently. It's actually got to the same point of these different plants producing caffeine via different evolutionary paths. It's convergent evolution, which means if something's convergent evolution, like bat wings evolved to help bats fly, but bird wings evolved in a completely different way, right? It means it's a useful thing. So more than one plant has evolved the ability to produce caffeine, which means it must be useful.
It's not just a side effect of some other process.
Yeah, it's not an accident, and because evolution is great like this. It's just this like toddler high on sugar, bumbling around, trying to make stuff happen. It ends up doing things that it didn't really mean to, but as long as it gets to the cake tray, it's fine. But caffeine clearly is not an accident. It's something that has been an advantage to plants, and that means when we drink it, it's an advantage to us, right?
I'm starting to suspect you're not going to be so relentlessly pro-caffeine.
Hey!
Like up until I'm like, great bit, Helen. Okay, what's next?
So I'm starting to think I'm going to take all this pro-caffeine rhetoric back to my wife, and maybe I'll start drinking coffee again.
Yeah, you will be able to fly further and faster with more pollen
Yeah.
in the future. So I found out a whole bunch of stuff about decaf coffee because I just really wanted to know what was in the stuff I was drinking. And it basically is decaf coffee is not completely caffeine free. It's not possible to get completely caffeine free coffee because of the processes they use, right? There's a bunch of different processes. It always happens to the green beans before they're roasted, which I didn't know. I thought they like roasted it, you got your beans, and then they did some magic wave a wand over and say something and it I don't know. But no, it happens before the roasting, otherwise too much of the flavour gets destroyed. So the original method was to heat up the beans or soak them in water and then add a solvent to dissolve the caffeine and take it out of the beans. And the first batch...
Sounds effective, no problem.
Yeah, it sounds,
What's the solvent? Solvent doesn't sound good. Yeah. Solvent sounds like I'm going to clean my paintbrush. You know what I mean?
Yeah, one of the solvents they used is basically paint stripper.
Oh,
yeah,
that's less
one
good.
of the that's one of the ones that is still used now. So you add the solvent to the coffee beans, and it takes out loads of the flavour as well. So basically, you have to throw away the first batch of coffee beans, but then you use the same solvent coffee liquid soup to soak a fresh batch of beans, which means that this time the flavour stays in the beans because the soup that you've just put it in is pretty flavoury already, but the caffeine comes out. So every time you have decaf coffee, you're often drinking coffee that has been sat in its own chemical soup bathwater several times over.
Sounds way more natural.
Yeah.
And it certainly answers your question of why it tastes so bad.
There you go.
It does taste bad. I mean, and decaf
taste bad.
tea
It
is
does taste
just
bad.
awful, actually.
Well, I don't know. There are other methods as well, right? So this
Okay.
is the original one.
Okay.
The reason this was one of the first ones because a whole bunch of beans that were being transported by sea got filled with brine, seawater, and that decaffeinated them apparently. So then someone was given the job of trying to make this a better process. So they soaked them in brine, and then benzene was the original solvent, which is basically a petrol product. It probably causes cancer. So that method is not used anymore. Instead,
Yep, happy with that.
yeah, that's cool. So instead, there's a couple of things they use. You can use methylene chloride, that's basically paint stripper, or ethyl acetate. And you'll hate this. Ethyl acetate is called a natural solvent because it can be derived from fruit and vegetables,
That's
which means
great.
it gets
Natural.
called natural. But
The
actually,
chameleon word of the health food industry.
most of the time it's made as a petroleum byproduct. So that's kind of a slightly more natural one, I guess. It's the same thing as in nail polish remover or vinegar, right? So it's an edible product. It's the thing that smells of pears when you have nail polish remover. I don't know. I'm looking at two guys around the table here, and
Yeah.
you're like, I don't know.
One thing I know about vinegar is that so it's acetic acid, right?
Yeah,
And you can make acetic acid just with the chemical reactions, and it's much cheaper than making it the inverted commas natural way. But you're not allowed to call it vinegar. So if you go to a chip shop and you have a look at the bottle on the counter, it won't say vinegar on it because
It'll
it's
say-
just acetic acid.
Whoa.
Even though it's
It's the same thing.
molecularly
Same thing.
identical. Yeah.
So I went off caffeine to do one of these experiments where they check your reaction times with and without caffeine. But you have to lower your base level to start with. So I was like, okay, it'll be fun. And also, I'm kind of curious. Am I addicted to caffeine? Could I go without it? Would I stay? But because I'm a bit of a coffee nerd, I like good coffee. I walked into all my normal coffee shops in London and they're like, oh, we don't do decaf.
Yeah.
We can do you a chai something. I would have thought there'd be this big demand for decaf coffee. But they said the problem is there's not enough demand. And as well as obviously you've got to have whatever process to get the caffeine out, not enough people would come in and order a decaf. And so the stock would sit there and go stale and it's too expensive and they couldn't get it from their normal suppliers. So for them, it was a major faff to get it in. And then it would go stale because no one's ordering it.
Yeah.
And so they just wouldn't bother.
Based on 3 data points here, us around the table, I feel like demand is going up for decaf.
Well, no, it's actually gone down. I've got some stats on this. Genuinely, in the 80s, when coffee was absolutely disgusting, 15% of coffee drinkers choose decaffeinated, right? And that was back in the 80s. And now it's only about 8%. We've become, as a community, more addicted to coffee and less likely to choose decaf.
Isn't that because when coffee used to be gross, it didn't matter that decaf was
Different
also
type of gross.
gross.
But
Yeah, exactly.
then you'd think that would be the only reason to drink it, would be to get the caffeine.
Oh, that's
then
a good point.
Otherwise, it would be a complete waste of time. There's actually 2 more ways of decaffeinating coffee that don't use nail polish remover or paint stripper. There's the Swiss water registered trademark process, which is the one that claims to get 99.9% of
And that's the one
caffeine
that
out.
most cafes I spoke to, they would get Swiss.
They said, oh, yeah, we can get hold of some
technique.
Swiss
Yeah.
water. The Swiss water process is the favoured hipster coffee shop technique. And again, they basically soak the beans in soupy coffee water of their own particular soupy coffee brand that they've created. And that means that the flavour and the caffeine all gets completely distributed through the water and the beans. And then they take the water out, put it through some active charcoal filters, which only filter out the caffeine molecules and not the smaller flavour molecules. And then they put the decaffeinated liquid back into the soup of beans. And then that
Draws out more caffeine.
draws out more caffeine. They take the water, they get the caffeine out of that, they put it back in. And obviously, to get down to 0.1% of your original caffeine, that is a lot of time you have
Cycling
to
that
do
through.
that. So that's why the Swiss water registered trademark process is so expensive. Okay, there's one more, which I think is going to be Matt's new favourite decaffeination process.
Right.
The reason it doesn't happen very often is it's really expensive. You basically soak the beans in water and then blast them with a fire extinguisher.
What? Really?
Yeah.
So you
Pretty
freeze
much.
them?
No, you get liquid CO2 at
That's
pressures
amazing.
of about 70 times atmospheric pressure, and you put that into your tank of soaking beans, and the CO2 binds to the caffeine molecules, but not the flavour compounds.
Oh, that's incredible.
So
That's
you
really
basically
good.
get liquid CO2 as your solvent.
That
right?
sounds
How cool is
like
that?
the kind of coffee-making theatre that hipster cafes would love.
They should be doing it.
Come on.
Do you know what I like about that is they found the perfect solvent. The unfortunate thing is it's a gas.
Yeah.
So it's going to be really expensive
Under a
to
lot
do
of
it.
pressure.
So
and-
yeah, they let the CO2 filled with caffeine into another tank, and then they let the pressure off. So then the CO2 goes off one way, and the caffeine is just left in the tank. So you end up with caffeine in one tank, decaffeinated beans in the other. And this is the kicker: they sell that caffeine to people who make caffeinated beverages.
Do you think, honestly, that coffee tastes nice, or do you think that your addiction to caffeine gives you a sense that coffee is nice?
Yeah, definitely that actually.
Definitely
Yeah,
that. What do you think?
I think it tastes nice.
Okay.
I think it's an acquired taste, but like all good tastes in life, yeah, it takes some effort.
If you ask my toddler for the taste she hasn't acquired yet, it's going to be salad. So I mean, that's gonna,
Yes.
yeah.
The complex flavour of salad.
Yeah.
This podcast is sponsored by Brilliant.org, a website dedicated to promoting a culture of learning based on inquiry, curiosity, and openness to failure. That's one of their founding principles, which I personally think is fantastic. So if you haven't come across Brilliant.org before, they've got loads of puzzles, and they've got daily puzzles. I love the maths ones, do them all the time. That aside, they've also got loads of courses you can do. So if you've ever thought, you know what, I have not learnt enough maths and science and, engineering, this is a great way to get started. Or if you're like me and you have done a maths degree, but my goodness, it was a while ago, it's a fantastic place to do courses and brush up. So yeah, they've got other ones on things like quantum computing and relativity and neural networks. They're all the rage. For me, I enjoy mathematical fundamentals. These are the essential tools for mastering things like algebra and logic and number theory. I think amazing things which are all the more enjoyable when you're studying them because you want to learn them, not because you've got to get through a degree or school or something else. So I highly recommend checking out brilliant.org/APOUD, because as well as being an amazing company who want to increase access and inspire people when it comes to these STEM, science, technology, engineering, maths subjects, they also sponsor this podcast. So I think they're incredible folks over there who run brilliant.org, and if you go to brilliant.org/APOUD, not only are you supporting this podcast and the company who sponsors it and makes it possible, but you will also get 20% off an annual subscription. So that means 1 in every 5 things you learn will be completely free. There you are, brilliant.org/APOUD.
I want to talk about where coal comes from. So it comes out the ground.
Yeah.
But what's
We were all thinking that.
Yeah.
Right.
Where in the ground does it come from is an interesting question. So you've got different strata. You know, if you dig down into the earth, it's a bit like going back in time. So you dig through different layers that are laid down over geological history.
As you go down, the layers get older and older.
Exactly.
Does that mean the Earth is getting bigger and bigger?
I suspect not.
Just asking the questions.
Yeah.
Everyone's thinking.
Okay, to answer your question, no, it's not like a tree.
Oh.
So you dig down and down, and eventually you get to the Carboniferous stratum. And the reason it's called the Carboniferous stratum is because it's the coal layer. And the vast majority of the Earth's coal is in this layer.
Always that layer.
Yeah, in geological history.
So whatever continent or whatever plate you're on,
Yeah.
that's where it is.
And you can date it. So the bottom of the layer was 360 million years ago. The top of the layer was 300 million years ago. So the whole layer is 60 million years deep. So the vast majority of coal was made in this brief period, brief in geological terms, 300 million years ago. Why? Why is that the case? Well, the theory goes like this. Go back in time before there were trees, right? So all the plants were all the plants were
Like
soft.
shrubs?
Yeah, shrubs, leafy plants. Just through the process of evolution, some plant comes up with the ability to make lignins. And it's a structurally really useful molecule. It's the essence of wood.
Just imagine like Chanel, essence of wood.
Yeah.
So is this like another arrangement of carbon?
Yeah, it's typically an arrangement of carbons, hydrogens, maybe there's a phosphor in there or something like that.
This was a breakthrough arrangement, which was just super solid. It's like when, humans invented concrete.
Exactly.
Now we're building everything out of concrete.
Yeah, exactly.
And doing it bigger and better than ever before.
Exactly right. It's a breakthrough. It spreads around the globe. You've suddenly got all these woody plants. And so one thing you need to know about plants is the nutrient cycle. So plants take nutrients out of the soil and out of the air to grow, and then when they die, those nutrients break down into smaller parts that can be used again by new plants, and this is all powered by the sun. Except that the decomposition doesn't happen on its own. You need decomposers. So when a plant dies, these decomposers come along, that's bacteria and fungi, break these large molecules that the plants have built up out of smaller nutrients into smaller parts again that can be reused.
And what's in it for the decomposers?
So it's an oxidation reaction, so they get energy from the process themselves.
So they kind of eat it and break it down.
Exactly right.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So fungi and bacteria are nature's decomposers. Not all bacteria, obviously, but yeah. Anyway.
Hashtag not all bacteria.
So the fungi and the bacteria don't know how to break down lignins, this novel molecule. And so the trees, these woody plants, they fall over and they just kind of lie there.
It just sits there.
It just sits there and it, pile up and pile up and pile up. The point is, it hangs around for long enough without being decomposed that it eventually fossilizes. And that's coal. Coal is fossilized wood or fossilized woody material. And then 60 million years later, some fungus figures out how to digest lignins and effectively shuts down the production of coal. And that's why you've got this layer.
Now
of
something
coal.
can eat wood.
Yeah.
I heard about this and I Googled lignin, tree, coal, evolution or something. And the first article that came up was a paper from 2016, which debunked this whole thing. It wasn't like fifth or sixth down there. It was like number one.
No, I have seen it. I have seen the paper, and it's kind of like, well, I mean, I wouldn't say debunked.
Hang on, I want to hear from Helen now.
All right, whatever.
Well, the paper actually says such geobiological hypotheses as this sometimes persist based largely on the strength of their novelty without sufficient predictive testing. It's basically, that is the most academic cuss I have ever heard. Is that this sounds awesome, but that doesn't mean it's true.
I think that's a really good point. It reminds me actually of something I used to do when I do live shows for kids and stuff like that. I would talk about how a microwave works because the wavelength of the microwaves represents the resonating frequency of water molecules. That is not how a microwave works. Yeah, it's a fun one because it's like, the resonating frequency of water makes total sense.
Great explanation.
Yeah.
No, it's not that.
There are these like infectious explanations.
Yeah.
Where the explanation's so pleasing. It's like recently someone noticed on a Marmite jar, there's that little flat bit.
Uh-huh.
And they just tweeted, I've just realised on a Marmite jar, a little flat bit is so you can put it on its side and all the Marmite pools So if you put it on the side, it all kind of pulls there, and then you can easily get your knife in to get it out. And that just went everywhere. And eventually the original person was like, I just made it up. But now it's out there. Now there's this infectious explanation of why.
Has there been official word from the creators of Marmite?
Yeah, I don't know.
It's probably just about packing, isn't it?
I
Packing
suspect
of containers.
it's either efficiency in packing or it's avoiding damage.
Because if you've got a dome, that's surely going to get struck harder in one place
In a single
rather
point
than
than a flat surface. Very nice, yeah.
So
that is a very pleasing, infectious explanation.
Yeah, you see.
This is so
Everyone,
annoying. This was
tell
supposed
other
to,
people.
This was supposed to be about where coal comes from. Not why my explanation is bollocks, but it's interesting that explanations are often bollocks.
Well, you never know where the journey's going to take you, Steve.
Right, but you did want to know about the original paper.
No.
I'm very interested.
Yeah, go on then.
Right, so there's a whole load of different things that it talks about, like the fact that it was a very oxygen-rich atmosphere, that there's fossil evidence that things did rot even at this time. And the main one is that even if global plant growth was about 25% of what it is now, if the lignin wasn't being digested or decomposed by something, then there would be 3 gigatons of plant material every year, which would be way more coal than we actually have. Like, instead of 60 million years to get the amount of coal that we know about, it would have only taken about 1,000 years. So if there wasn't anything eating the woody plants, then the coal layer would be a lot thicker.
So I haven't read the paper, so I'm just going to say this off the top of my head in defense of my explanation. Presumably, the assumption isn't that, lignin comes along and suddenly all plants are made of lignin. So it's not like everything's suddenly a tree. Like, there's still stuff there to decompose, but also presumably lignin would decompose by other means. For example, UV radiation might decompose. Like, there may be non-fungus ways. And so, to make coal, you don't just need there to be no fungi around. There are other conditions that you need.
Like, lack of oxygen means that nothing decomposes.
Can I just paint the picture here? Because on one side of the table, Helen's got the actual paper in front of her with marked up with notes and stuff. On the other side of the table, Steve's just leaning back in his chair going, yeah, but maybe UV, I don't know.
All right, fine.
So the main upshot of it is basically saying there's lots of situations that seem to be showing that this lignin could be decomposed at the time. So it's not as clear cut. It's definitely not as clear cut.
Oh, definitely not.
You say, but it's a great TED talk, though, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, that's the problem, isn't it? Okay, here's what I'm doing, guys. I'm just trying to embody the person who wants to keep the story going.
Yeah.
Okay? That's what's happening. So hold on. You're saying that your story, I'm calling it your story now, might be interesting as well. And it's something to do with continents. What is it? Continents crushing?
So in the Carboniferous period, according to this paper, loads of the continents were moving around. And it basically just meant that these like soggy, tropical wetland regions,
peat bogs essentially,
got crushed more effectively during this period than at other times. So it's basically saying, there's maybe something to do with plants and stuff, but it's mostly just that situation, that environment and that geology of that time. It says, sorry to be a party pooper here, but your brilliant story about slow developing, decomposing fungus things is not
all of science, though.
Yeah. This is way more boring.
It's always a bit more complicated than the fun story.
Yeah.
Well, okay, right. So that's our 3 pieces of fuel for your brain in this episode. And if there's one thing we do all agree on, it's how appreciative we are that you are listening to this podcast. And, of course, we appreciate our amazing sponsor, Brilliant.org.
There's a whole load of extra show notes, links, images, and all that sort of stuff at festivalofthespokennerd.com/podcast.
Yep, you could read the original papers that Steve and I were discussing. And if you want something more neutral, then Matt's book, Humble Pie, is all about planes lacking fuel and maths mistakes. There's information about that there and some more adventures in decaf coffee.
Of course, we'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe to this podcast on your podcast app of choice. You'll get the new episodes straight away, and you can follow us on all the various social media. We are Festival of the Spoken Nerd on Facebook and Instagram, and on Twitter we make your life a bit easier by abbreviating it to FOTSN.
And you can email us at podcast@festivalofthespokennerd.com. Let us know what you think, or if you've got some unnecessary detail for us, we'd love to hear it. Helen, you've got a song to finish up.
Yes, I've recorded a new version of my song about Earth's ultimate source of fuel, which is, of course, the sun. So I basically win this episode completely. A couple of people to thank for this song. Firstly, you won't have heard this version of this particular song unless you've watched our Just for Graphs comedy special available at the Spoken Nerd shop, because Howard Carter, our music buddy, made this huge orchestral arrangement. It's absolutely wonderful, and I've re-recorded all of the lyrics and stuff like that just for this podcast. There's one more person to thank, a certain Mrs. Matt Parker, or Professor Lucy Green, as she is professionally known, who helped me to peer review the lyrics. So they are both factually accurate, and some of them rhyme. You can guess which bit she helped me with. You can hear the whole thing after the credits, and I think that's it from us. Bye!
Bye! The podcast of Unnecessary Detail is made by Festival of the Spoken Nerd. That's Helen Arney, Steve Mould and Matt Parker, with music by Howard Carter and design by Adam Robinson. Our brilliant producer is John Harvey. Thanks for listening.
I used to be someone. Now I'm just another son. One of 100,000 billion. You treat me insignificantly. You name a tabloid after me. Synonymous with paparazzi. Just a backdrop for Brian Cox on TV. Since Edwin Hubble, it's never been the same. Those pictures of other stars pushed me out of the frame. You never even gave me a proper name. Something like Alpha Centauri or Epsilon Tauri or Delta Libre. I'll even take HR2948 or Kevin. You've achieved nuclear fusion. Oh, well done. Made some helium from a little hydrogen. That's very cute. Well, every second I do that to 600 million tons. If I was Marilyn Monroe, you'd be the one I can't remember the name of from One Direction, which is all of One Direction. You should have stopped at Copernicus. Then I'd still be the center of your universe. You say I'm just an average ball of gas. Ha! I say you're talking out of Uranus. 1.4 million kilometers. That's my diameter. Tell me seriously, with those parameters, have you ever tried to put a hat on there? Hip, 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 hooray. Well, I'll be a red giant someday, and your world will go up in flames. In the meantime, please join my Facebook fan page. Seriously, I've only got 9 likes. Well, it's gone down to 8 now since Pluto defriended me. I will shine on.